Every day, the world gives us headlines. But headlines are not history. Headlines are fragments. They tell us what happened, but rarely what it means. Today's subject is real. The facts are real. The pressures behind it are real. Governments are making decisions. Markets are reacting. Armies, companies, voters, and leaders are all moving inside the same storm. This video is not fiction. It is not an invented speech. It is not the voice of Churchill returned from the grave. It is a modern geopolitical essay written through a Churchillian lens. A lens of war, money, courage, weakness, empire, technology, and power. So before we judge the day, we must understand it. And before we understand it, we must ask the only question that truly matters. What is this moment trying to tell us about the world that is coming? There are moments in history when a civilization does not collapse because its enemies defeat it on the battlefield, but because it can no longer honestly account for what it owes, not only in money, in promises. A state promises pensions. It promises security. It promises hospitals, schools, roads, armies, subsidies, salaries, defence, energy, protection, stability. It promises that tomorrow will look enough like yesterday for ordinary people to plan their lives. And then, one day, quietly, at first, the arithmetic rebels. The numbers no longer obey the speeches. The debt becomes too large, the interest too heavy, the voters too tired, the creditors too nervous, the central banks too constrained, the politicians too frightened, and the future too expensive. That is the world now standing before us. Not in some distant academic scenario, not in the imagination of pessimists, not in the margins of forgotten financial reports. It is written plainly in the documents of the institutions that governments themselves trust. The International Monetary Fund has warned that global public debt exceeded $100 trillion in 2024 and is expected to move toward 100% of global GDP by the end of this decade. The IMF's own language is restrained, institutional, diplomatic. But behind that restraint is a sentence of great historical weight. Public debt is high, rising, and more dangerous than it appears. And public debt is only the visible fortress wall. Beyond it lies the wider empire of obligations. Household debt, corporate debt, bank debt, shadow finance, mortgages, bonds, loans, credit lines, derivatives, unfunded promises, pensions, guarantees, and political expectations. According to Reuters, citing the Institute of International Finance, total global debt reached nearly $338 trillion by the second quarter of 2025. More recent Reuters reporting in May 2026 said global debt had climbed close to $353 trillion, while investors showed signs of diversifying away from US Treasuries. These are not merely numbers. They are the architecture of modern life. The mortgage is debt. The pension bond is debt. The government security inside a retirement fund is debt. The student loan, the municipal bond, the corporate note, the hospital financing, the credit card balance, the defence contract paid by borrowed money, the highway built through issuance, the rescue package funded by deficits. All are part of the same structure. And therefore, when someone says, with revolutionary simplicity, cancel the debt, one must answer with strategic seriousness. Whose asset shall be destroyed? Because every debt has two faces. To the borrower, it is a burden. To the lender, it is property. To the government, it is a liability. To the pension fund, it is tomorrow's pension. To the bank, it is an asset. To the insurance company, it is the reserve that pays claims. To the saver, it is the quiet promise that discipline will not be punished. To the state, it is the method by which it postponed pain. To the citizen, it is often the invisible foundation beneath a salary, a hospital, a pension, a mortgage rate, a currency, and a job. This is why the idea of a global debt cancellation is so dangerous as a phrase. It sounds like liberation. It may, in certain narrow cases, be necessary. Nations have restructured debts before. Empires have defaulted. Currencies have been devalued. Creditors have taken losses. Debtors have been rescued. History is full of such episodes. But a true global debt reset, a general erasure, a great cancellation across states, banks, corporations, and households would not be an act of bookkeeping. It would be an earthquake through the balance sheet of civilization. And it would not strike only the rich. That is the first illusion to destroy. The great mistake of the modern age is to imagine that debt belongs to bankers and billionaires alone. It does not. Debt belongs to the pensioner whose fund owns government bonds. Debt belongs to the worker whose employer survives on revolving credit. Debt belongs to the taxpayer whose government must refinance old promises with new borrowing. Debt belongs to the young family whose dream of a home depends on a functioning mortgage market. Debt belongs to the small shop whose supplier extends payment terms. Debt belongs to the hospital that borrowed to expand. Debt belongs to the soldier whose salary is paid by a treasury under strain. Debt is not outside society. Debt is society's nervous system. Cut it violently and the whole body convulses. Let us imagine then, not a fantasy, but a strategic scenario. Suppose the world enters a debt crisis so severe that governments begin speaking openly of cancellation. Not merely restructuring for one poor country, not merely a haircut for one bankrupt company, but a global political demand. Too much debt, too much interest, too much austerity, too much inequality, too much pressure. The voters revolt. The markets tremble. The leaders gather. The economists disagree. The central banks warn. The populists shout. The creditors panic. And somewhere in that storm, the phrase appears, cancel the debt. At first it sounds moral. Why should nations spend more on interest than on hospitals? Why should young generations inherit obligations they never voted for? Why should poor countries transfer resources to wealthy creditors? Why should taxpayers rescue financial systems that privatize profits and socialize losses? These questions are not foolish. They are real. They are powerful. They contain moral force. UNCTAD has reported that 3.4 billion people live in countries spending more on interest payments than on either health or education. That is not a statistic to pass over lightly. It means billions of human beings live under governments whose budgets are already being eaten by yesterday's borrowing before tomorrow's children are educated or tomorrow's patients are treated. The World Bank has also warned that developing countries paid out $741 billion more in principal and interest on external debt than they received in new financing between 2022 and 2024. The largest such gap in at least half a century. In 2024, the external debt of low and middle-income countries reached $8.9 trillion. So let no one pretend this question is invented. The debt burden is real. The injustice in parts of the system is real. The fragility is real. The danger is real. But history teaches that real suffering does not automatically produce wise solutions. A starving man may demand bread. But if the granary is burned in the name of justice, tomorrow's famine becomes worse. Debt cancellation may relieve one side of the ledger, but unless it is precise, negotiated, limited, and credible, it detonates the other side. And the other side is where ordinary people live. Consider the pensioner. In a peaceful country, far from war, far from markets, far from central bank meetings, an elderly woman receives her monthly pension. She does not think of bond yields. She does not watch treasury auctions. She does not read IMF fiscal monitors. She may never have heard of the Institute of International Finance, Yet her income may depend on a pension system that holds bonds, government bonds, corporate bonds, mortgage-backed securities, investment funds, and other debt instruments. OECD research on pension markets shows that asset-backed pension plans remain deeply connected to financial markets, and many pension providers and public pension reserve funds invest heavily in bonds, even though the exact allocation differs by country. Preliminary OECD data showed pension assets in OECD countries grew strongly in 2024, reaching around $61.5 trillion in pension plans, recovering from earlier market losses. Now ask, what is a bond? It is someone's debt. If that debt is cancelled, the pension fund does not celebrate. It loses an asset. A government bond cancelled is not only a government liberated, it may be a pension weakened. A corporate bond erased is not only a corporation rescued, it may be a retirement account reduced. A mortgage security destroyed is not only a borrower relieved, it may be a bank, insurer, or fund made insolvent. The slogan says, "Abolish the debt." The ledger replies, "Abolish the asset." And the pensioner asks, "Where is my payment?" This is the terrible symmetry of finance. It is not sentimental. It is not kind. It is not theatrical. It is simply the mechanism by which promises are transferred through time. Debt is time made tradable. One generation borrows from another. One institution lends to another. One state promises to pay later in exchange for resources now. A bond is a bridge between present hunger and future obligation. If the bridge is overloaded, it may collapse. But if it is blown up, both sides are stranded. Now consider the banks. Banks do not merely store money in vaults, as in old illustrations. They operate through balance sheets. On one side are liabilities, deposits, funding, obligations. On the other side are assets, loans, securities, mortgages, government bonds, reserves. When a bank lends, it creates an asset for itself and a liability for the borrower. When it buys government bonds, it holds state debt as an asset. When governments are considered safe, those bonds often become central to the financial system. If a large part of that debt is cancelled, the bank's assets fall. But its liabilities remain. Depositors still want their money. Other banks still want repayment. Regulators still demand capital. Customers still need payments to clear. This is how a debt jubilee can become a banking crisis. And a banking crisis does not remain in the bank. It arrives at the factory gate. It arrives at the supermarket. It arrives at the payroll office. It arrives at the mortgage desk. It arrives at the small business that suddenly cannot renew its credit line. It arrives at the citizen who discovers that the bank branch is open, but withdrawals are limited. The modern economy runs on confidence, and confidence is a form of oxygen. You do not see it when it is present. You only notice it when it disappears. In normal times, a worker is paid because the employer expects revenue. The bank extends credit. The supplier trusts payment. The government honours contracts, and the currency holds value. This entire chain rests on belief that obligations will be met. Break that belief violently, and commerce does not become free. It becomes suspicious. No one extends terms. No one lends cheaply. No one trusts long maturities. Everyone demands cash. Everyone shortens horizons. Everyone asks the oldest question in finance: will I be paid back? And if the answer becomes uncertain, then credit disappears exactly when society most needs it. This is the second illusion, that cancelling debt would automatically help the poor. Sometimes, in specific cases, debt relief can help the poor. A country crushed by impossible external obligations may need restructuring. A household trapped by predatory lending may need legal protection. A company overwhelmed by unsustainable leverage may need bankruptcy. These are not radical statements. They are part of functioning capitalism. But universal cancellation is different. Universal cancellation does not distinguish between justice and recklessness, between survival and opportunism, between impossible debt and productive credit, between predatory lending and legitimate saving, between a poor borrower and a wealthy debtor, between a corrupt government and a responsible saver. It swings the sword across the whole table. And who is least able to escape the blade? Not the billionaire with foreign assets, gold, land, private equity, political access, legal teams, and passports. Not the large corporation with lobbyists and emergency facilities. Not the state that can print currency, impose taxes, change rules, or negotiate from power. The most vulnerable are those whose wealth is ordinary, domestic, regulated, and visible. The bank depositor, the pensioner, the salaried worker, the small business owner, the family saving for a home. The person whose entire financial life is inside the system that the reset would shake. The rich can diversify. The middle class is trapped in trust. And trust is precisely what a disorderly debt cancellation destroys. Now we must look at the state itself. A state with high debt faces three choices: pay honestly, inflate quietly, or default openly. There are variations, but most roads lead to one of these gates. To pay honestly means raising taxes, cutting spending, growing the economy, or some combination of all three. To inflate quietly means reducing the real value of debt by allowing prices and wages to rise, while fixed obligations become lighter in real terms. This is the hidden tax. The tax that arrives not as a bill, but as a smaller shopping basket. To default openly means telling creditors they will not receive what was promised. All three have consequences. Austerity angers voters. Inflation punishes savers. Default destroys trust. And so leaders delay. They refinance, they roll over. They issue more debt to pay old debt. They promise growth. They blame predecessors. They blame foreigners. They blame markets. They blame war. They blame crisis. Sometimes they are right. Often they are not. But the arithmetic continues. In the old world, war was financed by treasure, taxation, and plunder. In the modern world, war is financed by debt. So is peace. That is the paradox. The welfare state, the warfare state, and the crisis state all compete for the same borrowed currency. Defense spending rises because the world is dangerous. Social spending rises because societies are aging. Interest spending rises because past borrowing must be serviced. Industrial policy rises because states want technological sovereignty. Climate spending rises because infrastructure must be transformed. Health spending rises because populations demand care. And all the while, the bond market watches. It does not shout. It does not campaign. It simply reprices. The bond market is democracy's stern accountant. It says to governments, you may promise what you like, but we will decide the price at which we lend. And when that price rises, the state discovers that sovereignty is not absolute. A country may control its parliament, its flag, its army, and its anthem. But if it depends on creditors, it must also negotiate with time. Look at the United States, not because it is weak, but because it is central. The US Treasury market is the foundation stone of modern finance. American government debt is not merely American. It is global collateral. It is held by foreign governments, banks, funds, insurers, reserve managers, and private investors. It's the instrument against which safety itself is often measured. US Treasury data for March 2026 showed foreign holders owned about $9.35 trillion in Treasury securities. Japan remained the largest foreign holder, with around $1.19 trillion. The United Kingdom held about $927 billion. Mainland China held about $652 billion. Reuters reported that Japan and China led declines in foreign treasury holdings that month, while overall foreign holdings fell from the previous month's record level. This does not mean the dollar system is collapsing tomorrow. One must not confuse movement with apocalypse. Markets move, reserves shift, Countries rebalance. Custody centers distort the picture. The US Treasury market remains vast, liquid and central. But the signal matters. When debt becomes enormous, even small changes in trust become strategic events. A world that slowly diversifies away from one country's debt is not merely making a portfolio decision. It is adjusting the architecture of power. This is where money becomes geopolitics. Debt is not only an economic instrument, it is a weapon, a dependency, a diplomatic channel, a pressure point, and sometimes a chain. A debtor needs access. A creditor has leverage. A reserve currency issuer has privilege. A sanctioned state learns what financial dependence means. A poor country facing dollar debt learns that exchange rates can become a national emergency. A military alliance learns that defense spending must be financed. A superpower learns that deficits can fund strength, until they begin to question strength itself. If one were to view the modern world through a Churchillian lens, the conclusion would not be sentimental. Power is not only tanks, ships, missiles, drones, and satellites. Power is the ability to borrow in crisis, to finance war, to sustain allies, to absorb shocks, to pay soldiers, to subsidize industry, to defend currency, to command confidence. The empire that cannot finance itself becomes theatrical. It may still speak loudly. It may still parade. It may still declare. But the creditor hears the tremor under the drum. This is why the question of debt cancellation must be treated not as a slogan, but as a question of regime survival. If debts are cancelled, who loses? If debts are honoured, who suffers? If debts are inflated away, who pays invisibly? If debts are restructured, who decides the hierarchy of pain? Because there is no painless answer. There is only the distribution of loss, and politics is the art of deciding who must bear it while convincing them it is justice. The poor country says, "We cannot pay." The creditor says, "You promised." The voter says, "Protect my pension." The worker says, "Protect my job." The taxpayer says, "Do not raise my burden." The central bank says, "Do not destroy price stability." The army says, "Do not cut defence." The hospital says, "Do not cut care." The market says, "Pay me more for risk." The politician says, "Give me another year." And history says, "You have had many years." This is the third illusion, that the crisis arrives suddenly. It rarely does. The explosion is sudden. The accumulation is slow. Debt grows because each year's compromise becomes next year's baseline. A temporary emergency becomes a permanent program. A crisis measure becomes an entitlement. A tax cut is kept. A spending increase is kept. A subsidy survives its reason. A war lasts longer than promised. A rescue package becomes precedent. A central bank intervention becomes expected. A deficit becomes normal. Normal becomes structural. Structural becomes sacred. Then the interest bill rises. At first, no one notices. Then experts notice. Then markets notice. Then rating agencies notice. Then voters notice only when services are cut or taxes rise. By the time the public hears the phrase debt sustainability, the room is already full of smoke. The IMF has warned that debt risks are worse than they appear, partly because official projections often underestimate future pressures and because political demands, defence, ageing, climate, industrial policy, and crisis response make adjustment difficult. That is institutional language for a hard truth. Governments have promised more future than they can easily finance. And yet, we must be careful. Debt is not evil by itself. Debt can build. Debt can defend. Debt can educate. Debt can carry a nation through war, depression, pandemic, or reconstruction. Britain did not defeat tyranny by balancing every ledger in the middle of battle. America did not build its interstate highways without public finance. Companies do not grow without credit. Families do not buy homes only with cash. The question is not whether debt exists. The question is whether debt serves strategy or replaces it. Wise debt buys future strength. Foolish debt rents present comfort. Wise debt builds productive capacity. Foolish debt buys political silence. Wise debt is matched by growth. Foolish debt depends on denial. And when denial ends, the bill does not disappear. It changes form. This is where the idea of obnulania miravoa dolga, the wiping away of world debt, becomes both seductive and dangerous. Seductive because it offers a clean line through a dirty problem. Dangerous because it mistakes accounting for reality. Imagine tomorrow morning, by some impossible agreement, a great portion of government debt is cancelled. At dawn, the debt estates appear lighter. By noon, pension funds are impaired. By afternoon, banks are questioned. By evening, bond markets freeze. By night, currencies move. By the next morning, governments announce guarantees. By the next week, central banks provide liquidity. By the next month, inflation expectations change. By the next quarter, credit for ordinary people becomes scarce. By the next year, the political question returns: who pays for the rescue of the system we just destroyed? For the citizen, the suffering would not come in one dramatic form. It would arrive through channels. First, savings. Bond funds fall. Pension accounts weaken. Insurance companies adjust. Banks restrict risk. Depositors become nervous. The safest assets no longer feel safe. Second, employment. Companies that depend on credit cannot refinance easily. Investment slows. Hiring freezes. Layoffs begin. Small businesses suffer first because they lack access to capital markets and political rescue. Third, inflation. If governments respond by printing or monetizing losses, prices rise. The poor suffer most because food, rent, energy, and transport consume a larger share of their income. Fourth, taxation. If governments recapitalize banks, guarantee pensions, and restore confidence, they need revenue. That means taxes, explicit or hidden. Fifth, public services. If the state cannot borrow cheaply, budgets tighten. Hospitals, schools, defence procurement, infrastructure, subsidies, local governments, all compete in a harsher room. Sixth, social trust. This may be the gravest wound. If savers believe discipline is punished while debtors are rewarded, society fractures morally. If debtors believe creditors are protected while citizens suffer, society fractures politically. A republic can survive poverty more easily than it can survive the belief that sacrifice is assigned dishonestly. And here we approach the heart of the matter. A debt crisis is never only financial. It is moral. It asks what a promise means. It asks whether a contract is sacred or conditional. It asks whether the future can sue the present. It asks whether the old have claims over the young. It asks whether creditors deserve repayment when repayment destroys society. It asks whether borrowers deserve relief when relief destroys trust. It asks whether money is a neutral instrument or a political weapon. It asks whether democracy can discipline itself before markets discipline it. These are not questions for accountants alone. They are questions for statesmen. And statesmanship is precisely what the age lacks. Modern politics is addicted to postponement. It has learned to convert every difficulty into a future liability. It borrows against the unborn, then praises itself for compassion. It prints to avoid reform, then calls inflation a surprise. It rescues markets, then condemns markets. It promises security, then neglects the productive foundations that make security affordable. A Churchillian view would not sneer at debt. It would ask whether the debt is tied to national survival, national renewal, or national decay. Debt incurred to survive a mortal struggle may be honourable. Debt incurred to avoid telling voters the truth is cowardice with interest. That is the distinction. The question then is not simply, will the world cancel its debts? The deeper question is, why has the world built a civilization in which cancellation can even be imagined? The answer lies in the grand bargain of the late modern era. Governments promised stability, central banks promised rescue, markets promised growth, citizens promised consumption, corporations promised efficiency, globalization promised cheap goods, technology promised productivity, and debt filled the gaps whenever reality disappointed the promise. When wages did not rise enough, households borrowed. When tax revenues did not cover spending, governments borrowed. When profits needed acceleration, companies borrowed. When crises struck, states borrowed. When asset prices wobbled, central banks eased. When voters grew angry, politicians spent. When wars returned, defense budgets rose. When supply chains broke, industrial policy returned. When populations aged, pension obligations expanded. Debt became the universal language of delay. But delay is not victory. It is merely the purchase of time. And time, like money, charges interest. This is why the coming debt reckoning will not be a technical debate hidden in ministries. It will shape elections. It will shape alliances. It will shape war spending. It will shape pensions. It will shape the dollar. It will shape relations between the United States and China, between Europe and its own welfare model, between developing countries and global creditors, between young and old, between savers and borrowers, between citizens and states. If the world tries to cancel debt, the result will not be universal freedom. It will be a battle over whose promise survives. The debtor will demand mercy. The creditor will demand law. The pensioner will demand security. The taxpayer will demand limits. The worker will demand employment. The young will demand a future. The state will demand obedience. The market will demand compensation. And beneath all these demands, one truth will remain. There is no such thing as a free cancellation of debt. There is only a transfer of pain. The only question is whether that transfer is orderly, negotiated, strategic, and honest, or sudden, political, chaotic, and disguised as justice. And in the world now forming, the danger is not merely that debts are too high. The danger is that leaders may wait until honesty becomes impossible. That is how great crises begin. Not because no one knew, but because everyone knew and still preferred another year. In every age, there is a phrase that sounds like liberation until it is translated into reality. Cancel the debt. It is clean. It is strong. It has the rhythm of justice. It sounds like a hammer striking the chains of an exhausted people. And in certain cases, one must admit, it may be necessary. There are debts that cannot be paid. There are debt contracts that were born in corruption, desperation, or geopolitical pressure. There are nations so crushed beneath interest payments that the word repayment becomes less an economic policy than a slow national suffocation. But a statesman must not be hypnotized by the music of a slogan. He must ask, what happens the morning after? Because the morning after is where history lives. The revolution shouts at night. The pensioner wakes at dawn. The crowd demands cancellation. The bank opens its balance sheet. The debtor celebrates relief. The creditor discovers loss. The politician declares victory. The currency begins to move. And somewhere, far from television studios and ministerial conferences, a family that never bought a bond, never traded a currency, never attended a Davos panel, and never read a central bank report discovers that its savings, salary, mortgage, pension, or grocery bill has changed. That is the cruel genius of debt. It hides its consequences inside ordinary life. The modern world has made debt so vast, so normal, so institutional, that many people no longer see it as a contract. They see it as weather. It is simply there. Governments borrow. Companies borrow. Households borrow. Banks lend. Funds buy bonds. Central banks adjust rates. Markets roll over old obligations into new ones. The machine runs, until one day it does not. The International Monetary Fund warned in 2000 so. 24. That global public debt was expected to exceed $100 trillion and reach about 93% of global GDP that year, moving toward 100% of GDP by 2030. The IMF also warned that debt may be worse than official forecasts suggest because future pressures, aging populations, defense spending, climate investment, industrial policy, and crisis response are difficult to contain politically. That is the first stone in the wall. The second is wider still. Reuters reported in May 2026, citing the Institute of International Finance, that global debt had reached a record near $353 trillion by the end of March 2026, roughly 305% of global GDP. The same report said the increase was driven largely by borrowing from the United States and Chinese state-owned firms, while investors showed signs of diversifying toward Japanese and European bonds and away from US treasuries. These facts must be spoken plainly. We are not discussing a small accounting adjustment. We are discussing the bloodstream of the modern economy. And if someone proposes to drain the bloodstream in order to cure the fever, we must ask whether the patient will survive the treatment. Let us begin with the pensioner, because the pensioner is the citizen most easily forgotten by revolutionary language. A debt cancellation is often presented as a strike against the creditors. But who are the creditors? Sometimes, yes, they are banks. Sometimes they are hedge funds. Sometimes they are wealthy private investors. Sometimes they are foreign governments. Sometimes they are institutions that have made foolish decisions and deserve losses. But often, the creditor is also the pension system. The creditor is the insurance company holding safe assets to meet future claims. The creditor is a retirement fund holding government bonds because regulators and tradition told it those bonds were prudent. The creditor is a worker who saved for 30 years and whose savings were invested, not in a vault, but in instruments that depend on someone else paying what they owe. OECD pension data shows how large this world is. Preliminary OECD reporting for 2024 said retirement assets continued to rise and exceeded their previous 2021 record, supported by positive investment gains. OECD material also places pension assets in OECD countries in the tens of trillions of dollars, with pension providers and public pension reserve funds deeply connected to financial markets. This is not abstract capital. This is deferred salary. A pension is work converted into a promise. A man gives his strength to the factory, the railway, the office, the army, the hospital, the school. He is told, not all your reward will come today. Some will be stored for tomorrow. So he trusts, he works, he contributes, he waits. If the assets behind that promise are impaired, the pain is not felt by finance alone. It is felt in the kitchen of old age. Now imagine a government announces that a portion of its debt is cancelled. The debtor state reduces its burden. The headline declares relief. But the pension fund holding that debt records a loss. If the loss is small, it can be absorbed. If it is large, the fund must adjust. How? There are only a few roads. Contributions rise. Benefits fall. Retirement ages increase. Taxes fill the gap. Inflation reduces the real value of future payments, or the promise is quietly rewritten. No politician wants to say this. They prefer heroic words. They say reset, fairness, reform, new beginning. But the pensioner does not eat slogans. He pays for heating, medicine, rent, transport, and food. He measures policy not by the applause it receives, but by the distance between his pension and the price of bread. And here we see the first human wound of debt cancellation. It punishes those who trusted the system enough to save inside it. The wealthy may hold land, gold, companies, private assets, foreign accounts, art, or political influence. They may lose money, certainly, but they are rarely naked before the storm. The ordinary saver is different. His savings are visible. His pension is domestic. His bank account is regulated. His income is reported. His future is denominated in the currency of his own government. He has obeyed the rules of the system. If the system breaks its own promises, he has nowhere elegant to hide. This is why a disorderly debt cancellation can become a moral crisis. It may relieve debtors, but it also tells savers that discipline was naive. It tells the careful citizen that caution did not protect him. It tells the pensioner that the promise made to him was conditional after all. And when that belief spreads, the damage is deeper than money. A society can rebuild a balance sheet. It is harder to rebuild trust. Now, turn to the banks. The bank is not merely a building where money sleeps. It is a balance sheet built on confidence. On one side, the bank owes money to depositors and lenders. On the other side, it owns assets, mortgages, business loans, government bonds, corporate securities, reserves. If those assets fall sharply in value, the bank's capital is damaged. If the damage is severe, the bank may become insolvent. But depositors do not care about the elegance of the bank's asset allocation. They want their money. This is how fear begins. Not with tanks in the streets, not with flames, not with revolution, but with a rumour, a phone call, a message, a queue, a withdrawal limit, a minister saying there is no reason to panic. Those words, once spoken, often become the first reason. In a debt cancellation scenario, banks holding cancelled or impaired debt would suffer losses. Some would survive. Some would need rescue. Some would restrict lending. Some would be merged, nationalised, recapitalised, or quietly supported by central banks. But the human consequence is immediate. Credit tightens. A business that expected to renew its loan cannot. A builder cannot finance construction. A shop cannot finance inventory. A farmer cannot finance equipment. A family cannot get a mortgage. A student cannot borrow on the same terms. A company delays hiring. A payroll becomes uncertain. The debt that was supposed to disappear returns as unemployment. And this is the second human wound. When credit breaks, work suffers. People often imagine financial crises as events affecting screens, charts, yields, indexes, currencies, bond spreads. But those screens are merely the nervous system, flashing warnings before pain reaches the body. The real economy feels it later. The restaurant closes. The factory cancels a shift. The startup fails to raise capital. The importer cannot obtain credit. The construction site slows. The local government delays maintenance. The employer says there will be no bonuses this year. Then no hiring. Then layoffs. And all the while, the public asks, how did a crisis in bonds become a crisis in jobs? Because bonds are not separate from jobs. Credit is the bridge between today's plan and tomorrow's production. Destroy the bridge, and the worker stands on one bank while the wage stands on the other. Here again, one must distinguish order from chaos. Restructuring is not always catastrophe. Bankruptcy law exists for a reason. Sovereign debt restructurings exist because some states truly cannot pay. Creditors sometimes take losses because the alternative is worse. There is nothing sacred about every loan ever written. But the question before us is not whether any debt can ever be reduced. The question is, what happens if the world, overwhelmed by $353 trillion of obligations, attempts a broad political erasure? That would not be bankruptcy law. That would be financial regime change. And financial regime change has consequences that cannot be confined to those who attend the negotiation. Now, consider the state budget. A government borrows because it spends more than it collects. Sometimes this is wise. In war, depression, pandemic, or national emergency, borrowing can preserve the life of the state. There are moments when debt is not irresponsibility, but survival. But when borrowing becomes permanent, the state grows accustomed to a dangerous comfort. It no longer asks what it can afford. It asks what it can finance. There is a difference. Affordability is tied to production, taxation, growth, and social consent. Financing is tied to market confidence. When confidence is abundant, governments mistake it for strength. When confidence retreats, they discover that the bond market was not a servant, but a judge. UNCTAD's 2025 World of Debt report says that 3.4 billion people live in countries spending more on interest payments than on either health or education. It also says developing countries' interest payments have been growing rapidly and crowding out critical public spending. This is the world before cancellation. Already, debt service is competing with hospitals. Already, interest is competing with schools. Already, yesterday's borrowing is eating tomorrow's capacity. So, when people demand debt cancellation, they are often responding to a real and visible injustice. Why should a country spend more rewarding creditors than educating children or treating the sick? That question deserves respect, but the answer cannot be childish. If a country cancels debt and loses access to future credit, how will it fund hospitals next year? If creditors flee, how will it import medicine, fuel, machinery, grain, or technology? If its currency collapses, what happens to the price of food? If its banks hold the cancelled debt, who rescues the banks? If the rescue requires printing money, who pays through inflation? If taxes rise, who bears them? If spending falls, which ministry is cut? If the army is cut, who protects the border? If education is cut, who protects the future? A country may be strangled by debt, but if it cuts the rope carelessly while standing on a cliff, it may fall. This is the strategic dilemma. Debt relief must sometimes happen, but it must preserve the possibility of tomorrow. The goal is not merely to escape the creditor. It is to remain a functioning country after the escape. That is why the most serious debt restructurings require negotiation, sequencing, legal clarity, and credible reform. The purpose is not to satisfy bankers. The purpose is to prevent the cure from becoming another disease. Now look at inflation. Inflation is the oldest method of partial debt cancellation. It is cancellation without confession. The government does not say, "We will not pay." It pays in money worth less. The bond matures. The coupon is paid. The pension arrives. The salary increases slightly. The state insists it has honoured its obligations. But prices have moved faster. The promise survived in nominal terms and died in real terms. This method is politically attractive because it's difficult for the public to identify the exact thief. A tax has a name. A spending cut has a vote. A default has a date. Inflation enters through every price tag and denies responsibility. It says, "I am the weather." But inflation is not weather. It is often the consequence of policy, shock, scarcity, war, currency weakness, fiscal pressure, monetary accommodation, supply disruption, or some mixture of these. It may begin outside government control, but governments often decide whether it becomes temporary pain or a long corrosion. In a world attempting debt cancellation, inflation would likely become one of the main channels of pain. If banks, pension funds, and governments suffer losses, states may step in. If states step in without enough tax revenue, they borrow. If markets do not lend enough at tolerable rates, central banks may be pressured. If money creation expands while confidence falls, the currency weakens. If the currency weakens, imports rise in price. If imports rise, living standards fall. The citizen sees the final result, not the chain. Milk costs more, fuel costs more, rent costs more, medicine costs more, electricity costs more. The family does not say, "The sovereign debt restructuring impaired institutional balance sheets and forced fiscal monetary accommodation." The family says, "Everything is more expensive." And it is right. Inflation is not an abstraction when you live close to the line. It is a tax on breathing room. For the wealthy, inflation is unpleasant. For the poor, it is immediate. For the middle class, it is humiliation by arithmetic. A person can work as hard as before, earn the same or even slightly more, and still feel poorer. That is the special cruelty of inflation. It allows a society to pretend incomes are rising while lives are shrinking. This is the third human wound. Debt cancellation often returns as price pressure. Now, let us bring the matter to the great powers. The United States sits at the center of the world's financial order because its debt is not merely debt. US Treasuries are collateral, reserve asset, safe haven, benchmark, and geopolitical instrument. They are woven through the balance sheets of banks, central banks, pension funds, insurers, and governments. Reuters reported in May 2026 that pressure in G7 government debt markets had intensified, with rising borrowing costs driven by inflation, geopolitical crises, aging populations, defense needs, and climate spending. The same reporting noted long-term government bond yields under pressure, including US 30-year borrowing costs above 5% and Japan's long-term yields reaching levels not seen for decades. This matters because when the price of government borrowing rises, the state becomes less free. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar not spent elsewhere, unless it is borrowed again. Interest is the past demanding tribute from the present. In calm times, this tribute is tolerable. In crisis, it becomes political. Citizens ask why roads decay while bondholders are paid. Soldiers ask why equipment is delayed while interest is paid. Teachers ask why classrooms are crowded while interest is paid. Doctors ask why hospitals are strained while interest is paid. Young people ask why taxes rise to pay for promises made before they were adults. And creditors ask why they should lend to governments that may one day call repayment immoral. This is where the debt question becomes a question of power. A state that cannot control its debt cannot fully control its destiny. A government that depends on endless refinancing must consider the mood of creditors. A superpower that runs large deficits while financing allies. Defense, industrial policy, and social promises must preserve confidence not only by military strength, but by fiscal credibility. The cannon and the bond auction are not separate instruments. They are part of the same arsenal. A country may have aircraft carriers, satellites, nuclear submarines, and advanced missiles. But if its borrowing costs rise relentlessly, if its currency is questioned, if its creditors demand higher compensation, then power becomes more expensive to maintain. Empire has always required finance. Rome needed taxes, tribute, land, coinage. Britain needed credit, navy, trade, and the city. America needs treasury markets, dollar liquidity, technological dominance, military reach, and investor trust. The modern battlefield includes the bond market, not because traders are generals, but because generals require budgets, and budgets require confidence. Now consider Europe. Europe faces aging populations, welfare commitments, energy transformation, defense pressure, and the return of war to the continent. The old assumption that security could be outsourced, energy could be imported cheaply, industry could be optimized globally, and welfare could be financed comfortably is under strain. The debt issue in Europe is not merely about deficits. It is about the model of society. How much welfare can be preserved? How much defense must be restored? How much industry must be subsidized? How much green transition can be financed? How much taxation can voters bear? How much borrowing can markets accept? A debt cancellation in such an environment would not be a clean act of justice. It would be a fight over the European social contract. Pensioner against taxpayer, North against South, saver against debtor, national budget against European rules, defence against welfare, climate against industry, markets against politics, And in the background, Russia, China, the United States, energy markets, migration pressures, and technological competition would not pause politely while Europe solved its balance sheet. History does not wait for fiscal committees. Now consider developing countries. Here the moral case for debt relief is often strongest. Many developing countries borrow in foreign currency. They do not control the currency in which they must repay. When the dollar strengthens or global rates rise, their debt burden grows even if their own people did nothing wrong. When commodity prices fall, revenues decline. When disaster strikes, borrowing rises. When geopolitical shocks hit, capital flees. The World Bank reported that low- and middle-income countries' external debt reached $8.9 trillion in 2024, and that from 2022 to 2024, developing economies paid out $741 billion more in principal and interest on external debt than they received in new financing. That is a brutal fact. It means money is flowing out of countries that often need investment most. In such cases, debt restructuring may not be radical. It may be realism. But even here, the method matters. If relief is orderly, it can restore growth. If it is chaotic, it can isolate the country. If creditors accept losses as part of a credible plan, investment may return. If cancellation is seen as political seizure, capital may flee for a generation. The poor nation does not need only freedom from yesterday's debt. It needs access to tomorrow's capital. A bridge must be repaired, not burned. Now we must speak of households. For the household, debt cancellation can look like salvation. Imagine a family with a mortgage that consumes half its income. Imagine a young person drowning in student loans. Imagine a worker carrying credit card debt at punishing interest. Imagine a farmer whose loan became impossible after drought or currency collapse. Debt relief here can be humane. Bankruptcy systems exist because permanent debt slavery is incompatible with a healthy society. A system without forgiveness becomes feudal. A system with too much forgiveness becomes unstable. The art is balance. If household debts were broadly cancelled, some families would experience immediate relief. Consumption might rise. Stress might fall, homes might be saved, there would be real human benefit. But the second-order effects would arrive. Banks and investors holding those loans would suffer losses. Future lending standards would tighten. Interest rates for new borrowers would rise. Down payments would increase. Credit scores would become harsher. Mortgages would become less available. Landlords might demand more guarantees. Small businesses relying on personal credit would face difficulty. And a political division would open between those whose debts were forgiven and those who had already paid. One family sacrificed for years to repay its mortgage. Another receives cancellation. One student worked 2 jobs to avoid loans. Another sees loans erased. One small business avoided expansion to remain debt-free. Another borrowed aggressively and was rescued. Even if cancellation is economically justified, the moral tension is real. A society cannot ignore the psychology of fairness. People will accept pain when they believe it is shared honestly. They will rebel against relief when they believe it rewards recklessness and punishes discipline. This is why debt policy must be designed with moral intelligence, not only fiscal arithmetic. Because money is never only money. Money is memory. It remembers who worked, who waited, who trusted, who gambled, who was rescued, who was abandoned. And if the memory becomes bitter, politics becomes dangerous. Now we approach the deeper strategic question. If global debt cannot be cancelled without pain and cannot be paid without pain, what will governments actually do? They will try to avoid a dramatic moment. They will prefer quiet redistribution. Not one great cancellation, but many small erosions. Not one global default, but selective restructurings. Not one declaration of bankruptcy, but years of inflation. Not one tax, but many fees, levies, bracket creeps, financial repression, regulatory changes, pension reforms, spending caps, and currency adjustments. The most likely future is not a clean debt jubilee. It is a long debt digestion. Governments will attempt to reduce the real burden of debt through growth, moderate inflation, controlled interest rates where possible, higher taxes, spending restraint, and occasional restructuring. They will call this responsibility. Voters will call it decline. Markets will call it adjustment. Historians may call it the price of delay. But if leaders wait too long, the controlled path closes. Then comes the harsher choice: austerity or inflation, default or repression, taxation or devaluation, confiscation by law or confiscation by prices. And in every case, ordinary people pay. They pay through smaller pensions. They pay through weaker currencies. They pay through fewer jobs. They pay through higher taxes. They pay through reduced public services. They pay through housing becoming inaccessible. They pay through savings earning less than inflation. They pay through political anger. They pay through social distrust. They pay through the quiet death of expectations. This is the truth that must be said without hysteria and without softness. Debt is not cancelled. It is transformed. It becomes inflation. It becomes taxation. It becomes default. It becomes unemployment. It becomes lower pensions. It becomes bank rescues. It becomes currency weakness. It becomes political extremism. It becomes generational conflict. It becomes a smaller life than the one people were promised. And yet, one must not end in fatalism. There is still a difference between wise adjustment and disaster. Countries can reform before markets force them. They can distinguish productive investment from political bribery. They can protect the vulnerable while admitting that not every promise can be expanded forever. They can restructure impossible debts without destroying the entire credit system. They can tax intelligently rather than punitively. They can invest in growth, energy resilience, technological capacity, education, defence, and infrastructure. They can restore seriousness to budgets. They can tell voters the truth. But that requires a quality now rare in democratic politics: the courage to disappoint people before catastrophe does it for you. The easy leader promises that no one will lose. The serious leader explains that losses already exist. The coward hides the bill. The statesman decides how to distribute it with the least destruction to the nation's future. That is the essence of the debt reckoning. Not whether pain can be avoided, it cannot, but whether pain will be governed. Because if democratic states do not govern the debt problem will govern them. It will govern their budgets. It will govern their elections. It will govern their alliances. It will govern their military options. It will govern their currencies. It will govern the young against the old, the debtor against the saver, the taxpayer against the pensioner, the national interest against the global market. And then, at last, citizens will discover what debt always was. Not merely money borrowed from the future, but power borrowed from the future. And the future, when it finally arrives, always demands repayment. There is a kind of power that marches. It wears uniforms. It carries flags. It moves through deserts, seas, skies, and borders. It builds bases, launches missiles, guards trade routes, patrols oceans, and redraws maps. This is the power that citizens understand instinctively. They see the ships. They see the aircraft. They see the soldiers. They see the ruins when power fails and the parades when power wishes to be seen. But there is another kind of power. It does not march. It settles. It clears payments. It prices oil. It anchors reserves. It finances deficits. It determines who can borrow in crisis and who must beg in crisis. It decides which nation can spend beyond its tax base for years and which nation is punished in months. It does not wear a uniform, yet armies depend upon it. It does not speak in speeches, yet governments tremble before it. This is the power of credit. And in the modern world, credit is not merely economic. It is geopolitical. A nation that can borrow cheaply in its own currency possesses a strategic weapon. A nation that must negotiate with fear. A nation whose debt is trusted can survive shocks that would break others. A nation whose debt is doubted must pay more for every ambition. Every factory, every pension, every road, every hospital, every missile, every subsidy, every election promise. That is why debt is never just debt. Debt is the price of trust, and trust is the currency of power. If the world ever attempts a great debt cancellation, the first consequence will not be a neat accounting exercise. It will be a reordering of geopolitical trust. The question will not only be, who owes what? The question will be, who can still be believed? For the United States, this question is immense. The American debt market is not merely a national funding mechanism. It is one of the foundations of the global financial order. US Treasuries are treated as collateral, reserve asset, benchmark, liquidity instrument, and safe haven. They sit inside the reserves of central banks, the portfolios of pension funds, the balance sheets of banks, the risk models of investors, and the strategic calculations of governments. When the United States borrows, it does not borrow like other countries. It borrows at the center of the system. This has given America extraordinary flexibility. It can run large deficits and still finance itself. It can respond to crises with massive spending. It can support allies, fund wars, rescue markets, subsidize industries, and maintain a global military footprint while issuing obligations the world still largely accepts. But privilege is not the same as immunity. And power funded by debt must constantly renew the confidence that makes the debt possible. In March 2026, foreign holdings of US Treasuries declined from the previous month's record level. According to US Treasury data cited by Reuters, foreign holdings fell to about $9.348 trillion. Japan remained the largest foreign holder at around $1.192 trillion, while China's holdings fell to about $652.3 billion, their lowest level since 2008. The United Kingdom increased its holdings to around $926.9 billion, reflecting its role as a global investment hub. One must be careful here. This does not mean the dollar system has collapsed. It has not. This does not mean China has abandoned American debt entirely. It has not. This does not mean the United States can no longer finance itself. It can. But history is often written not by sudden collapse, but by slow changes in preference. The Roman road does not vanish in a night. The imperial currency does not lose credibility in a single morning. The Great Fleet does not rot all at once. The institutions of power weaken first at the margin, then in the imagination, then in the arithmetic, and finally in reality. The shift of even a portion of global investors away from US Treasuries matters because the Treasury market is not just another market. It is the financial language of American power. Reuters reported in May 2026 that global debt had reached a record near $353 trillion by the end of March 2026, around 305% of global GDP, citing the Institute of International Finance. The same reporting said investors were showing signs of diversifying away from US Treasuries toward Japanese and European bonds, though it also stated there was no immediate threat to the roughly $30 trillion US Treasury market. That last phrase is important. No immediate threat. History often begins with that comfort. No immediate threat to the empire. No immediate threat to the currency. No immediate threat to the border. No immediate threat to the alliance. No immediate threat to the banking system. And yet, the accumulation continues. The debt rises. The interest bill rises. The political division rises. The creditor questions rise. The strategic pressure rises. And one day, what was once no immediate threat becomes, why did no one act earlier? The United States is not Greece. It is not Argentina. It is not a small country borrowing in someone else's money. It issues the world's dominant reserve currency. It has unmatched capital markets, military reach, technological depth, energy capacity, and institutional resilience. Any serious analysis must admit this. The American system has been declared doomed many times and has repeatedly outlasted its critics. But the wiser question is not whether America collapses tomorrow. The wiser question is whether America's room for error is shrinking. A state can be strong and still constrained. A giant can still be indebted. A creditor can still ask a superpower for more yield. And if the price of American borrowing rises structurally, then every choice in Washington becomes more expensive. Defense becomes more expensive. Industrial policy becomes more expensive. Tax cuts become more expensive. Entitlements become more expensive. Interest itself becomes a rival ministry. A silent department of the state that spends without building, consumes without employing, and grows without asking permission. This is where debt becomes political destiny. The United States must finance not only itself, but the architecture of an order it helped create. NATO commitments, Indo-Pacific deterrence, support for Ukraine, technological competition with China, naval dominance, energy security, semiconductor strategy, AI infrastructure, border pressures, social spending, disaster response, and the continuous expectation that Washington will act when systems break. Every empire discovers that prestige creates obligations. Every obligation requires funding. Every funding mechanism requires trust. And every trust relationship has limits. Now consider China. China stands on the other side of the great financial argument. It is a creditor, a manufacturer, a strategic rival, a holder of reserves, a state with immense domestic debt problems of its own, and a power seeking to reduce vulnerability to the dollar system without destroying the export machinery that depends on global demand. China's relationship with US debt is not simple. It has reduced its holdings over time, yet it cannot easily escape the consequences of the system in which it grew rich. It wants less dependence on the dollar, but it also wants stable trade. It wants influence over global finance, but it controls capital tightly. It wants the yuan to matter more internationally, but trust in a reserve currency requires openness, legal credibility, liquidity, and confidence, qualities not created by decree. China also carries its own debt burdens, especially in local governments, property markets, state-owned enterprises, and shadow finance. The global debt story is not America versus a debt-free China. It is America with reserve currency debt and China with state-directed leverage. One borrows through markets. The other buries risk inside institutions, local governments, property developers, and policy banks. Reuters' May 2026 report on global debt noted that the increase in global debt was driven largely by borrowing from the United States and Chinese state-owned firms. This is the great irony of the age. The two largest powers on Earth are not standing above the debt system. They are pillars inside it. America borrows to sustain consumption, security, global leadership, and political promises. China borrows to sustain investment, employment, industrial strategy, local growth targets, and state-led development. One prints the world's dominant money. The other produces much of the world's goods. One has the deepest capital markets. The other has the deepest manufacturing base. Both are powerful. Both are exposed. And both understand that debt is not only domestic arithmetic, it is a strategic battlefield. If a global debt cancellation were ever proposed, the United States would ask whether the dollar order survives. China would ask whether its holdings, trade position, and domestic financial system survive. Europe would ask whether its welfare state survives. Developing countries would ask whether relief finally arrives, or whether they are once again forced to pay the highest price for a system they did not design. And markets would ask the oldest question of all: what is still safe? Safety is the crown jewel of finance, not profit. Profit can be found in risk. Safety is rarer. The world needs assets that large institutions can hold without constant fear. It needs collateral. It needs reserves. It needs instruments that banks, funds, governments, and insurers can treat as reliable. If sovereign debt loses that status broadly, the consequences are not revolutionary freedom. They are financial darkness. Everyone begins to demand higher returns. Everyone shortens maturities. Everyone avoids long promises. Everyone wants liquidity. Everyone asks for collateral. Everyone distrusts everyone else. And the cost of the future rises. That phrase matters. The cost of the future. Debt is the way societies bring the future into the present. They borrow to build now, fight now, consume now, survive now, and promise to repay later. If trust in repayment collapses, the future becomes more expensive. Projects that once made sense no longer do. Infrastructure is delayed. Housing slows. Defense procurement is stretched. Energy transitions become harder. Technology investment concentrates among giants. Small nations pay more. Small firms pay more. Young families pay more. A debt crisis is therefore not only a crisis of the past, it is a tax on the future. Now Europe must be examined with cold seriousness. Europe has lived for decades under a bargain. Generous social systems, relatively low military spending compared with the United States, reliance on American security guarantees, deep trade with China, energy dependence that once included cheap Russian supply, and confidence that economic integration would soften geopolitics. That world has cracked. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine shattered the illusion that continental war was a relic. Energy shocks exposed the vulnerability of dependency. The return of great power competition exposed the weakness of underinvestment in defense. The rise of China challenged industrial assumptions. The United States, under changing administrations and shifting public moods, has made Europeans wonder whether American protection can be taken for granted forever. And now, Europe faces a financial dilemma. More defense spending is necessary. More industrial policy is demanded. More energy investment is required. More support for Ukraine may be needed. More technological investment is urgent. More pension and health spending is built into aging societies. But the old European welfare model was not designed for a world in which social spending, defense mobilization, green transition, industrial subsidy, and geopolitical competition all rise together. Debt is where these pressures meet. If Europe borrows too much, markets question sustainability. If Europe taxes too much, growth suffers and voters rebel. If Europe cuts welfare, social contracts fracture. If Europe underfunds defense, security weakens. If Europe underinvests in technology, dependence deepens. If Europe hesitates, history moves without it. That is the European trap. In a Churchillian frame, one might say Europe is being asked to become historical again. Not merely regulatory, not merely commercial, not merely moral, historical, to make choices under danger, to pay for defense, to preserve social peace, to build industrial strength, to accept that a continent cannot outsource power forever. But the debt burden makes every act of seriousness harder. A continent that must spend more on security while aging rapidly cannot treat fiscal policy as a bureaucratic exercise. It becomes a question of survival. What kind of Europe can still be financed? Now consider Ukraine. Ukraine is not merely a war in Europe. It is a test of whether democracies can finance resistance over time. Armies fight with courage, but courage requires ammunition. air defense, drones, salaries, logistics, reconstruction, hospitals, pensions, energy systems, and macro financial support. War is paid for twice, first in blood, then in debt. And sometimes the second cost lasts long after the first battle is over. Ukraine's future will depend not only on battlefield outcomes, but on the architecture of financing, grants, loans, frozen Russian assets, European support, US support, IMF programs, reconstruction funds, private investment, and debt sustainability. If aid fatigue grows in donor countries burdened by their own debts, Ukraine feels it. If interest costs squeeze Western budgets, Ukraine feels it. If political movements rise against foreign spending, Ukraine feels it. Thus, sovereign debt in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, Paris, Rome, London, and Warsaw is not separate from the war. It shapes the endurance of the coalition. This is how money becomes ammunition. The same is true in the Indo-Pacific, deterring conflict around Taiwan, sustaining naval capacity, building semiconductor resilience, funding AI infrastructure, hardening supply chains, and preparing for possible crisis all require vast spending. Great power competition is not cheap. The return of industrial strategy is not cheap. The duplication of supply chains for security reasons is not cheap. The militarization of technology is not cheap. Globalization once promised efficiency. Geopolitics now demands redundancy. Efficiency lowers costs. Redundancy raises them. The world is choosing redundancy because danger has returned. Debt will finance much of that choice. This means the debt problem is not happening in a peaceful vacuum. It is happening while the world is rearming, fragmenting, aging, digitizing, and competing for technological supremacy. The IMF has warned that public debt pressures are being intensified by defense needs, aging populations, climate spending, industrial policy, and persistent political pressures. Global public debt exceeded $100 trillion in 2024 and is expected to approach 100% of global GDP by the end of the decade. That is not an accounting footnote. That is a strategic warning. The world is entering an age in which states need more money precisely when money is becoming more expensive. That is the dangerous intersection. When money was cheap, governments borrowed easily. When peace seemed stable, defense could be postponed. When populations were younger, pensions were less burdensome. When globalization lowered prices, inflation looked conquered. When central banks had room to cut rates, crises could be softened. But now, rates have been higher. Wars have returned. Populations are aging. Supply chains are political. Energy is strategic. Technology demands enormous capital. Voters are angry. And the debt stock is already immense. If one were designing a crisis in a laboratory, one could hardly choose a more combustible mix. Now let us return to the idea of debt cancellation. In such a world, a global debt reset would not simply redistribute money. It would redistribute power. Countries whose debt is cancelled may gain breathing room. Countries whose institutions hold that debt may lose capital. Currencies associated with cancelled obligations may weaken. Creditor nations may retaliate. Debtor nations may gain sovereignty in the short term but lose market access. Reserve currencies may be questioned. Alternative payment systems may gain attention. Gold may be revalued psychologically, if not officially. Capital controls may return. Financial blocks may harden. And the world may become less integrated, less trusting, and more regional. This is how a financial act becomes a geopolitical rupture. Imagine a developing country declares that its external debt is illegitimate and will not be paid. If it is small, markets punish it. If many countries do it together, creditors panic. If great powers support them, the system splits. If China offers alternative financing, Western institutions lose influence. If Western creditors refuse relief, anti-Western politics grows. If the IMF demands austerity, governments face unrest. If debtors turn to rival blocs, finance becomes diplomacy by other means. This is not conspiracy, it is power. Credit has always followed flags, and flags have always followed credit. The British Empire was built not only by ships, but by the ability to finance ships. The American order was built not only by armies, but by the dollar system that made American guarantees credible. China's rise was built not only by factories, but by credit expansion, state-directed investment, and the recycling of trade surpluses into global assets. Money and empire are never strangers. They are relatives, sometimes brothers, sometimes rivals, sometimes executioners. Now, the developing world must be treated not as a victim category, but as a strategic theatre. UNCTAD's 2025 report says global public debt surpassed $100 trillion in 2024, and it highlights that 3.4 billion people live in countries spending more on interest than on either health or education. It also notes that developing countries face rising debt service pressures and net debt outflows. This means that for many countries, the debt crisis is not future tense. It is present tense. It is not a theoretical collapse of the bond market. It is the school not built, the clinic not staffed, the road not repaired, the medicine not imported, the electricity grid not upgraded, the child whose education is delayed by an interest payment to creditors abroad. That reality will have political consequences. A population that sees its government paying creditors while basic services fail becomes fertile ground for anger. Some of that anger will be justified, some will be exploited, some will become nationalism, some will become anti-Western sentiment, some will become radical economic policy, some will become migration pressure, some will become instability. Debt, therefore, is not only a budget issue, it is a security issue. A state crushed by debt can become unstable. An unstable state can become a migration source, a conflict zone, a proxy battlefield, a failed market, a humanitarian emergency, or a diplomatic opening for rival powers. The creditor may think it is defending a contract, but if defending the contract destroys the country, the creditor may inherit a larger strategic problem. This is why wise debt relief is not charity, it is order maintenance. But again, the manner is everything. A negotiated restructuring can preserve dignity and function. A reckless cancellation can destroy market access. A punitive refusal can radicalize politics. A corrupt bailout can reward bad elites. Austerity without growth can break societies. Relief without reform can rebuild the same trap. There is no simple path, only serious paths and unserious ones. Now look at commodities. Debt and commodities are linked by the dollar. Many commodities are priced globally in dollars. Many debts are owed in dollars. When the dollar strengthens, countries that earn local currency but owe dollars suffer. When oil rises, importers suffer. When food prices rise, poor countries suffer. When interest rates rise in the core economies, capital leaves the periphery. When capital leaves, currencies weaken. When currencies weaken, dollar debts become heavier. The circle tightens. In such a world, debt cancellation becomes especially tempting for countries caught in external traps. But if done badly, it can lead to currency collapse, import shortages, and inflation. A country may cancel dollar debt and still need dollars to buy fuel. A country may denounce creditors and still need capital to build ports. A country may reject austerity and still need medicine priced in foreign currency. Sovereignty is not declared. It is financed. This is the bitter lesson. Now we must speak of technology and artificial intelligence. At first glance, AI seems far from debt. It is not. The AI race requires enormous capital expenditure. chips, data centers, electricity, cooling, grid upgrades, cloud infrastructure, research, talent, defense integration, and industrial scaling. Governments see AI as a national power technology. Companies see it as a market revolution. Militaries see it as a command, intelligence, cyber, and autonomy accelerator. This race will be financed by corporate debt, equity markets, state subsidies, sovereign funds, energy investment, and public-private partnerships. In a world of debt stress, the AI race favors those who can still finance scale. If credit tightens, the strongest firms become stronger. If states face fiscal pressure, only the richest governments can subsidize strategic technology. If interest rates remain high, speculative players fail. If debt cancellation damages capital markets, long-term technology investment suffers. Thus, even the future of artificial intelligence is linked to the credibility of debt. The machine age requires electricity. Electricity requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires capital. Capital requires trust. And trust, again, leads us back to debt. Now consider oil and energy. Energy transitions are capital intensive. Fossil fuel systems require investment. Renewable systems require investment. Nuclear requires investment. Grids require investment. Storage requires investment. LNG terminals, pipelines, ports, refineries, transmission lines all require financing. If global credit conditions worsen, energy investment becomes harder. If energy investment becomes harder, prices become more volatile. If energy prices become volatile, inflation becomes harder to control. If inflation persists, debt servicing becomes more politically explosive. This is the loop. Debt affects energy. Energy affects inflation. Inflation affects rates. Rates affect debt. Debt affects politics. Politics affects war. War affects energy. And so the circle closes. This is why the modern statesman cannot separate economics from strategy. The finance minister, the defense minister, the energy minister, the central banker, and the foreign secretary are all working on the same battlefield, whether they admit it or not. Now let us imagine the geopolitical consequences of a badly managed global debt reset. First, reserve diversification accelerates. Countries reduce dependence on any single sovereign debt market, especially if they fear political seizure, sanctions, inflation, or cancellation. They hold more gold, more alternative currencies, more regional assets, more commodities, more strategic reserves. Second, financial blocs harden. The world divides not only by military alliance, but by payment systems, reserve preferences, lending institutions, sanctions regimes, and credit networks. Third, poorer countries become arenas of financial competition. Western institutions offer restructuring under conditions. China offers infrastructure finance under different conditions. Regional powers offer bilateral deals. Private creditors demand enforcement. Populations demand relief. Elites arbitrage between blocs. Fourth, democratic politics becomes more volatile. Voters in creditor countries ask why their pensions or taxes should absorb losses abroad. Voters in debtor countries ask why they should suffer for contracts written under previous governments. Populists on all sides gain language. Fifth, war financing becomes harder. If governments must pay more to borrow, long conflicts become more difficult to sustain. Aid becomes more controversial. Defense spending competes more with domestic promise. Sixth, monetary credibility becomes a national security asset. That countries with trusted currencies gain room to maneuver, and countries without it face harsh adjustment. This is the world that would emerge. Not a world free from debt. A world obsessed with creditworthiness. A world in which every promise is interrogated. Now, in such a world, what would a Churchillian mind ask? Not, who has the most debt? But, Who can carry debt without losing command? There is a difference. A strong nation can carry heavy debt if it has growth, productivity, trust, institutions, military necessity, social cohesion, and a credible plan. A weak nation can be broken by smaller debt if it lacks currency credibility, political stability, productive capacity, and national unity. The number matters, but the structure matters more. Who holds the debt? In what currency? At what maturity? At what interest rate? For what purpose was it borrowed? Does it finance consumption or capacity? Does it build industry or buy votes? Does it strengthen the nation or sedate it? These questions separate strategy from arithmetic. A country borrowing to build energy independence may be wiser than a country borrowing to postpone reform. A country borrowing to defend itself may be acting with necessity. A country borrowing to inflate asset prices may be poisoning its future. A country borrowing in its own currency has more room. A country borrowing in foreign currency has less. A country with deep domestic savings has options. A country dependent on external creditors has vulnerability. A country with political trust can adjust. A country with fractured legitimacy may explode. Therefore, debt is not judged by size alone. It is judged by purpose, structure, credibility, and time. And yet there is one universal danger, the belief that the future will always refinance the present. That belief is the narcotic of declining powers. It whispers to governments, do not choose now, do not cut now, do not tax now, do not reform now, do not disappoint voters now, borrow, roll over, delay. The market will absorb it, growth will return, inflation will ease, rates will fall. Technology will save us. The next administration will handle it. The next generation will understand. This is not strategy. It is sleepwalking with a bond prospectus, and the world has done too much of it. Now the bill is no longer hidden. It is visible in IMF reports, Reuters data, UNCTAD warnings, treasury tables, bond yields, rating debates, pension reforms, tax arguments, and the political anger rising across democracies and developing countries alike. Global public debt exceeded $100 trillion in 2024. Total global debt has reached around $353 trillion. Billions of people live in countries where interest competes with health and education. Foreign holders of US treasuries adjust their exposure. Developing countries face net debt outflows. Defense spending rises. Aging costs rise. AI and energy require capital. The world is more dangerous, not less. These are facts. The interpretation is this. The debt question is becoming one of the central power struggles of the 21st century. Not because debt is new, debt is ancient, but because the scale is modern, the system is global, the politics are fragile, and the strategic pressures are rising together. The world has borrowed heavily in an age that assumed relative peace, deep globalization, low inflation, and cheap money. Now it faces war, fragmentation, aging, rearmament, technological rivalry, energy transformation, and higher political volatility. That is not merely a balance sheet problem, that is a historical turn. If debts are paid in full, societies may suffer austerity and stagnation. If debts are inflated away, savers and workers suffer quietly. If debts are cancelled disorderly, banks, pensions, currencies, and trust suffer loudly. If debts are restructured wisely, pain is contained but not abolished. If debts are ignored, markets eventually impose terms. In every path, the central question remains: who bears the loss? This is the question every empire tries to postpone. This is the question every democracy fears. This is the question every creditor frames as law and every debtor frames as justice. And this is the question that will define the next stage of global politics. For the age of cheap promises is ending, not in a single crash, not in one dramatic speech, not in one global conference, but slowly through yield curves, budgets, currencies, pensions, elections, defense bills, subsidy fights, debt restructurings, and the growing realization that power without fiscal discipline becomes performance. A nation may still roar, but if it cannot finance its roar, the world hears the weakness beneath it. That is the warning. Not that debt means immediate ruin, but that debt, unmanaged, becomes a rival sovereign. It commands budgets, it shapes alliances, it narrows choices, it disciplines leaders, it divides citizens, it weakens deterrence, it tempts inflation, it invites demagoguery, it gives foreign creditors influence, it turns time itself into an adversary. And when time becomes the enemy of a state, no army can fully protect it. The state must regain command of its promises, or the promises will command the state. That is the geopolitical meaning of the debt reckoning. It is not merely about money. It is about who will have the power to act when the storm comes. When people speak about cancelling debt, the conversation often becomes too simple too quickly. One side imagines liberation, remove the burden, free the debtor, restart the system. The other side imagines collapse, break the contract, destroy trust, punish savers. Both reactions contain part of the truth, but neither is enough. A debt reset is not one thing. It depends on what kind of debt is being reduced, who holds it, what currency it is written in, how large the loss is, and whether the process is negotiated or chaotic. This is the part that often gets lost. Debt is not just a number owed by one side. It is also an asset held by another side. A government bond is a liability for the state, but an asset for a pension fund, a bank, an insurance company, a central bank, a foreign reserve manager, or an investment portfolio. A mortgage is a burden for the household, but an asset for the lender. A corporate bond is a liability for the company, but income for whoever bought it. So the question is not simply, what happens if the debt disappears? The better question is, where does the loss go? That is the practical issue. The global numbers explain why this matters. The IMF warned that global public debt was expected to exceed $100 trillion in 2024 and move toward 100% of global GDP by the end of the decade. Reuters, citing the Institute of International Finance, reported in May 2026 that total global debt had reached nearly $353 trillion, around 305% of global GDP. UNCTAD's A World of Debt 2025 report says 3.4 billion people live in countries spending more on interest than on either health or education. The World Bank reported that the external debt of low and middle-income countries reached $8.9 trillion in 2024. These figures do not mean that every country is about to default. They also do not mean that all debt is the same. The United States, Japan, Italy, China, Ukraine, Ghana, Argentina, and Germany all sit in different positions. Some borrow mainly in their own currency. Some depend more on foreign creditors. Some have deep domestic savings. Some carry debt that is tied to productive capacity. Some carry debt that reflects years of weak growth, political delay, or external shocks. But the scale does tell us something important. Debt has become one of the main structures through which modern life is financed. That is why a reset would not remain inside the financial system. It would move into ordinary life through several channels. The first channel is inflation. Inflation is not usually described as debt cancellation, but in practice it can reduce the real value of debt. If a government owes a fixed amount of money and the currency loses purchasing power, the debt becomes easier to carry in real terms. The state may still repay what it promised on paper, but the money is worth less than creditors expected. For the government, this can look like a solution. It avoids the legal drama of default. It avoids an official restructuring. It allows the state to say that it has honoured its obligations. For citizens, the effect is different. A pension may still arrive, but buy less. A salary may still be paid, but stretch less. A bank deposit may still show the same number, but represent less real security. This is why inflation is politically convenient and socially dangerous. It spreads the cost widely, and it does so in a way that is difficult to trace back to one decision. A formal default has a date. A tax increase has a law. Inflation feels more diffuse. People notice it through groceries, rent, fuel, medicine, school costs, insurance, repairs, and daily services. That is one reason inflation can become a quiet form of debt adjustment. It does not erase the debt directly. It changes the value of the money used to repay it. The second channel is restructuring. This is more direct. A country or company may negotiate with creditors to extend maturities, reduce interest rates, reduce principal, or exchange old debt for new debt under different terms. This can be necessary. Some debts cannot be paid in full without damaging the borrower's ability to recover. A country that spends too much on debt service may have too little left for health, education, infrastructure, defense, and basic administration. A company with an unsustainable debt load may be unable to invest, hire, or survive. A household buried under impossible obligations may never return to normal economic life without some form of relief. So restructuring is not automatically reckless. In many cases, it is more realistic than pretending the debt will be paid in full. The question is how it is done. If it is negotiated early, with clear terms and a credible plan afterward, it can restore stability. If it is delayed too long, it usually becomes more painful. If it is sudden and political, it can damage trust and make future credit much more expensive. This is especially important for countries that borrow in foreign currency. They cannot simply print the money they owe. If their currency weakens, the real burden of external debt rises. That is why developing economies often face a harsher version of the debt problem. They may need dollars or euros to service debt, import energy, buy medicine, or finance essential goods. If market access closes, the problem becomes not only financial, but practical. The World Bank reported that low and middle-income countries' external debt reached $8.9 trillion in 2024. While interest rates on newly contracted public debt from official creditors reached a 24-year high, and rates from private creditors reached a 17-year high. That means many countries are not just carrying large debt, they are refinancing in a more expensive environment. For these countries, debt relief may not be an ideological question. It may be a condition for basic development. But even there, debt relief has to preserve access to future financing. A country does not only need relief from yesterday's debt, it also needs the ability to fund tomorrow's roads, energy systems, ports, schools, hospitals, and businesses. The third channel is the banking system. Banks hold loans and securities as assets. If those assets are written down, bank capital can weaken. If the losses are large enough, banks may reduce lending, seek government support, merge, or fail. For the ordinary person, this does not appear as a bond market issue. It appears as tighter credit. A small business may find that its credit line is no longer renewed. A developer may delay a project. A family may face a higher mortgage rate or stricter down payment requirements. A company may postpone hiring because financing has become more expensive or uncertain. This is how a debt reset can affect employment, not because someone announces that jobs must be cut, but because the financial conditions behind business activity become more restrictive. Credit is not the whole economy, but it is part of the economy's ability to move. When credit becomes scarce, businesses become cautious. When businesses become cautious, investment slows. When investment slows, hiring often slows after it. The fourth channel is pensions and insurance. This is one of the most sensitive parts of the issue because many people do not realize how connected pensions are to debt markets. pension funds and insurers often hold government bonds, corporate bonds, and other fixed income assets because they need predictable future payments. If these assets are impaired, the effect depends on the size of the loss and the structure of the system. Sometimes the fund can absorb it. Sometimes contributions need to rise. Sometimes benefits are adjusted. Sometimes the state fills the gap. Sometimes inflation reduces the real value of future payments without changing the nominal promise. This does not mean every debt restructuring destroys pensions. That would be too dramatic. But it does mean that any broad debt reset has to ask who holds the assets being reduced. A haircut on bonds held by speculative investors is one thing. A haircut on bonds held by domestic pension funds is another. The same financial operation can have very different social consequences depending on who is on the other side. The fifth channel is taxes. If debt losses damage banks, pension funds, public budgets, or essential institutions, governments may step in. That support has to be financed somehow. It may come through higher taxes, new levies, reduced deductions, higher social contributions, or spending cuts elsewhere. This is one of the reasons the phrase "cancel the debt" can be misleading. Even when a debt is reduced for one group, the public sector may later absorb part of the cost to stabilize the system. In that case, taxpayers end up carrying some of the loss indirectly. This is not always wrong. Sometimes public intervention prevents a larger crisis, but it should be understood clearly. A rescue is not costless simply because it avoids immediate collapse. The sixth channel is public services. Debt service already competes with other spending in many countries. UNCTAD reports that 3.4 billion people live in countries spending more on interest than on either health or education. That is a useful way to understand the trade-off. Interest is not just an accounting line. It can crowd out other priorities. If a country tries to avoid default by paying creditors in full, public services may suffer. If it restructures debt disorderly and loses market access, public services may also suffer. If it inflates the debt away, public services may continue on paper but become more expensive to provide. This is why the problem is not solved by choosing one word: payment, default, inflation, or cancellation. Each path has a cost. The question is, which cost is least damaging and most honest? The seventh channel is trust. This is harder to measure, but it may be the most important over time. Financial systems depend on expectations. People deposit money because they believe they can withdraw it. Pensioners accept long-term promises because they believe institutions will survive. Investors lend because they expect repayment, or at least a predictable legal process if repayment fails. Citizens pay taxes because they believe the state will provide some level of order and service. A badly managed debt reset can damage these expectations. If savers feel punished for being cautious, they may change behavior. If creditors believe contracts can be rewritten too easily, they demand higher interest rates. If citizens believe banks are rescued while households are abandoned, political anger grows. If younger workers believe they are being taxed mainly to maintain promises made to older generations, generational tension increases. This is where debt becomes political. The financial loss matters, but the interpretation of the loss also matters. People can accept difficult decisions if they believe the process is fair, understandable, and necessary. They react differently if they believe losses are hidden or distributed according to political influence. That is why a debt crisis often becomes a legitimacy crisis. Not immediately and not everywhere. But over time, people start asking who the system protects first. That question can be destabilizing. There is also a geopolitical layer. A country with heavy debt and rising interest costs has less room for strategy. It may still speak confidently, but its choices become narrower. More money spent on debt service means less room for defense, energy security, industrial policy, infrastructure, or social support. This matters now because the world is not entering a low-pressure period. Europe is rearming. The United States is managing strategic competition with China while carrying high fiscal obligations. Ukraine depends on sustained external support while fighting a war. Developing countries face high debt service costs. Artificial intelligence requires large investment in chips, data centers, electricity, and infrastructure. Energy security has again become a central issue. Aging populations are raising pension and healthcare costs. So the debt problem is arriving at the same time as many governments need more financial capacity, not less. That is the strategic difficulty. Debt does not automatically make a country weak. A country can carry large debt if it has strong institutions, productive capacity, trusted currency, deep domestic markets, and a credible path forward. But debt does reduce flexibility when interest costs rise or confidence weakens. This is especially important for reserve currencies and major bond markets. Reuters reported that global debt reached nearly $353 trillion by March 2026 and noted signs of investors diversifying away from US Treasuries, although the report also said there was no immediate threat to the roughly $30 trillion US Treasury market. That distinction matters. It's not a collapse story. It's a signal that even the strongest markets are being watched more carefully. For a major power, borrowing capacity is part of national power. It helps finance military spending, crisis response, industrial policy, research, infrastructure, and alliances. If the cost of that borrowing rises, policy becomes harder. The state can still act, but the price of action rises. This is why a global debt reset would affect power relationships, not only domestic budgets. Creditors and debtors are not spread evenly across the world. Some countries hold large reserves. Some depend on external financing. Some issue debt in currencies others want to hold. Some borrow in currencies they do not control. Some have strong legal credibility. Others depend on political negotiation. If losses are imposed, the question becomes international. Which countries absorb them? Which institutions are protected? And which borrowers are allowed to recover? That is where debt becomes diplomacy. Debt relief for one country may be treated as humanitarian necessity. For another, it may be treated as strategic competition. A country important to a military alliance may receive support more easily than one with less geopolitical value. Creditors may be more flexible when instability threatens migration or security or access to resources. Rivals may offer alternative financing to gain influence. This does not make debt relief fake. It means debt relief happens inside a world of power. Now, if we bring this back to ordinary people, the likely outcome of a debt reset is not one dramatic event. It is more likely to be a gradual change in conditions. In one place, people may see higher inflation. In another, pension rules may change. Elsewhere, taxes may rise. Some countries may restructure external debt. Some banks may reduce lending. Some businesses may face higher financing costs. Some governments may cut or delay spending. Some savers may receive returns that do not keep up with prices. Some households may receive targeted relief, while future borrowers face tighter rules. This is less cinematic than the phrase global debt reset, but it is more realistic. The reset may not arrive as a headline. It may arrive as a series of adjustments that slowly changes who carries the burden. For people, the most important point is not to treat all debt relief as good or all debt repayment as good. Both can be wise or damaging depending on the situation. If a debt truly cannot be paid, pretending otherwise can make the final loss larger. If a debt can be paid but is cancelled for political convenience, future trust may be damaged. If inflation is used to reduce the burden quietly, people with savings and fixed incomes may pay without being told clearly. If austerity is used too aggressively, society may lose growth and stability. If banks are rescued without accountability, public anger rises. If banks are allowed to collapse carelessly, ordinary depositors and businesses may be hurt. The issue is not whether pain can be avoided completely. In a large debt overhang, some loss already exists. The issue is whether that loss is recognised early, allocated carefully, and connected to reforms that prevent the same cycle from repeating. A useful way to judge any debt proposal is to ask several practical questions. Who benefits immediately? Who takes the loss? Does the loss fall on those who knowingly accepted risk, or on people who thought they were holding safe assets? Does the policy restore growth, or only delay the next crisis? Does it preserve access to future credit? Does it protect essential services? Does it damage the currency? Does it create incentives for better decisions afterward? Does it explain the trade-off honestly? These questions are less dramatic than saying, cancel the debt or honour every contract, but they are more useful. A serious debt policy has to balance two truths. The first truth is that contracts matter. Without trust in contracts, borrowing becomes more expensive, investment becomes harder, and the future becomes more difficult to finance. The second truth is that societies also matter. If debt service destroys the social and economic base of a country, full repayment may be mathematically correct and politically destructive. Good policy lives between these two truths. It does not worship creditors. It does not romanticize default. It tries to preserve the ability of the economy to function after the adjustment. That is probably the most important point. What does the system look like afterward? After a restructuring, can the country grow? After household relief, can credit still function? After bank support, is there accountability? After pension reform, do people still trust the system? After inflation falls, do savers believe the currency again? After taxes rise, does the state use the revenue productively? If the answer is no, then the reset has only moved the problem forward. If the answer is yes, then even a painful adjustment can become part of recovery. And this is where the discussion should end. Not with the idea that debt can be erased, and not with the idea that every debt must be preserved exactly as written, but with the recognition that debt is a claim on future resources. When too many claims are made on the future eventually pushes back. It may push back through higher interest rates, weaker currencies, slower growth, inflation, political conflict, or formal restructuring. The form changes, but the basic issue is the same. The promises have to be brought closer to what the economy can actually support. For ordinary people, this will not feel like an abstract correction. It will feel like the cost of living, the availability of credit, the reliability of pensions, the level of taxes, the quality of public services, and the stability of work. That is why the subject matters. A debt reset is not only about what governments owe. It is about how societies decide who absorbs losses when old promises become too large for the present economy to carry. And the better that decision is made, the less destructive the adjustment becomes.